I wasn't hunting for proof of giants. I was studying old buildings, trying to understand why certain doorways stood absurdly tall, why staircases seemed built for people much larger than us. At first, I thought it was just decorative excess, something architects did to make spaces feel grand. But then I found something that changed everything. Photographs. Not paintings or folklore or stories passed down through generations. Actual photographs from the 1860s and 1870s showing impossibly tall human beings standing next to regular-sized people. And here's what made my stomach drop. These weren't fake. The grain of the film matched perfectly. The lighting was consistent. The shadows fell exactly where they should. These images came from an era before the technology to create convincing forgeries even existed. I checked with experts, cross-referenced the photographic techniques of that period. Everything pointed to one disturbing conclusion. These photographs were real. And that's when I realized the official explanations I'd been taught my entire life were about to fall apart. Because if these images were authentic, then everything we've been told about human history in the 1800s is incomplete at best. You won't believe what I found next. The deeper I dug, the more photographs surfaced. Carte de visite from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, tintype images showing men, and occasionally women, standing 8, sometimes 10 feet tall. These weren't circus performers with documented traveling routes and promotional materials. These were just people. Individuals photographed in formal settings, wearing period-appropriate clothing, sometimes surrounded by family members of completely normal height. The British Museum archives contain several of these images. The Smithsonian mentions them in passing, then dismisses them as medical anomalies without any further investigation. French collections show similar photographs, all catalogued and filed away. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature serving in ceremonial roles. The pattern is always identical. Acknowledge the evidence, categorize it, then move on. Never investigate deeper. Never ask the obvious questions. Why were there so many of these individuals? Why do the photographs cluster in specific decades, primarily between 1850 and 1900, then suddenly vanish? Why do contemporary written accounts describe these individuals not as freaks or curiosities, but as normal members of society holding positions of authority, working as guards, overseers, foremen of major construction projects? But here's where it gets strange. Many of these photographs show the giants standing directly in front of buildings. Massive buildings with doorways that seem absurdly oversized for normal humans. Doorways that suddenly make perfect sense when you're looking at a 9-foot-tall person standing in the frame. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I started measuring doorways in government buildings from the 1700s and 1800s, 12 to 15 feet high. Not just at the main entrance where grandeur might make sense. Inside, in working corridors where there's no reason for such height, staircases with risers so tall that a normal person has to stretch uncomfortably just to climb them. Furniture, desks, chairs, beds found in estate sales and museums, all slightly too large, all dismissed as decorative or custom-made for unusually tall individuals. But it's not just one building, it's thousands. Courthouses across America, administrative buildings throughout Europe, government complexes in Russia, India, South America, all built during the same period, all featuring the same oversized proportions, all supposedly designed this way for aesthetic reasons, despite the obvious impracticality, despite the enormous added cost, despite the fact that it makes no functional sense whatsoever, unless the people using them weren't average-sized. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the 1700s have 12-foot doors in back hallways. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures feature staircases requiring enormous strides. In Delhi, colonial-era government buildings, supposedly built by and for British administrators, contain furniture at scales that would make a 6-foot man feel like a child. These weren't ceremonial spaces. These were working buildings, offices, administrative centers, the everyday architecture of governance and oversight. So who exactly were they built for? That's where Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. If you're not familiar, Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s as a vast territory spanning northern Asia. Not a legend, not a myth. An actual labeled region appearing in encyclopedias, atlases, and historical records with the casual certainty of France or Spain. Then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it vanishes. Not conquered, not renamed. Erased. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias stop mentioning it. The history books pretend it never existed. But the architecture remains. Massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, buildings of impossible scale and precision, doorways sized for giants, halls that echo with vastness, all supposedly built by various empires or local craftsmen with no documentation, no verified construction records, no explanation for how they achieved such engineering feats with the technology supposedly available at that time. What if the giants weren't anomalies? What if they were the administrators, the overseers, the guardian class of a civilization we've been taught to forget? What if Tartaria, whatever it actually was, employed these individuals not as curiosities, but as functional members of society? And the architecture reflects that reality. It would explain the photographs, why they're always formal and official, showing these individuals in positions of authority. Why they disappear after the 1890s, right when the last references to Tartaria vanish from official records. Why the buildings remain but the occupants have been completely written out of history. The photographic record isn't the only evidence. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers across America regularly reported discoveries of giant human skeletons, not scattered anomalies, systematic findings. The New York Times, 1885, 7-foot skeleton discovered in Michigan Mound. The San Diego Union, 1895, bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. The Middletown Signal, 1899, giant human remains uncovered in Ohio. These weren't tabloid sensations. These were mainstream newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy, but not particularly controversial. The accounts describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, often found in organized burial sites, frequently accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy and construction knowledge. Then something changed. After approximately 1920, these reports stop. Not gradually, abruptly. Discoveries that were once front-page news simply cease to appear. The skeletons already found, many were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study. The Smithsonian now claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. Missing, lost, misplaced during routine transfers. Hundreds of specimens, all vanished without proper documentation. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Discoveries peak in the late 1800s, the same period the giant photographs appear, the same period Tartaria disappears from maps. Then everything stops. The photographs stop. The newspaper reports stop. The maps change. The encyclopedias rewrite themselves, as if someone decided certain questions were no longer acceptable to ask. But why would anyone want to bury this evidence? Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the giants weren't rulers? What if they were a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and construction. What if their size was functional, not ceremonial? What if buildings were scaled to them because they were the ones overseeing their construction and maintenance? It would explain the architectural patterns. Why government buildings, courthouses, administrative centers, structures of oversight and control feature oversized proportions, while residential areas remain human-scaled. Why the photographs show giants in formal, official contexts rather than domestic settings. Why historical records mention them in roles of supervision and authority, but rarely as merchants, artists, or common laborers. It would explain the construction mystery. How were massive stone structures built with such precision in the 1700s and 1800s? Maybe they weren't built by the civilizations we credit them to. Maybe they were built for those civilizations by a previous society that employed individuals physically capable of moving stones, operating machinery, and overseeing construction at scales we consider impossible. And it would explain the systematic erasure. If you're inheriting structures you didn't build, inheriting technology you don't fully understand, inheriting architectural systems designed for a different type of human being, what do? You adapt the narrative, you claim it as your own, you rewrite the construction dates, backdate the architects, and remove any evidence that suggests someone else was here first. Think about how many mysterious construction techniques suddenly make sense if the builders were physically larger and stronger than modern humans. What disturbs me most isn't the evidence itself. It's the coordinated silence surrounding it. Academic institutions don't debate the giant skeletons. They pretend they never existed. Museums don't display the photographs. They file them in archives marked miscellaneous or unverified. Historical societies don't investigate the architectural proportions. They dismiss them as artistic choice. The pattern repeats across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of scholarship. It's not active suppression, it's passive erasure. Questions that simply aren't asked, evidence that isn't examined, dots that aren't connected because connecting them leads to conclusions that don't fit the established narrative. And when you point it out, when you lay the evidence side by side, the photographs, the architecture, the newspaper reports, the missing records, you're met with the same response. Interesting, but not significant. As if coincidence explains everything. As if patterns don't matter. As if asking why is somehow inappropriate. But the why is the entire point. Why did humans of extraordinary size exist in sufficient numbers to be regularly photographed and regularly discovered in burial sites? Why were they documented, then forgotten? Why does architecture from a specific period accommodate their proportions? Why do these elements cluster in the same geographical regions and time periods as Tartaria's disappearance from cartographic record? And why, when you mention any of this in academic circles, does the conversation immediately shut down? There's something they don't want us to understand. I keep returning to the photographs. These weren't monsters. They weren't myths. They were people. Individuals with faces, clothing, families. People who stood for formal portraits like anyone else in the 1800s. People whose existence was so unremarkable at the time that photographers saw no need to explain or contextualize their presence. But we've made them remarkable by erasing them. We've made them impossible by denying they were ever possible. We've turned documented reality into forbidden speculation. And, in doing so, we've lost something. Not just knowledge of who they were, but understanding of what we are, what we've forgotten, what we've inherited without comprehension. The massive doorways remain. The oversized staircases still stand. The buildings that make no sense for human proportions continue to serve modern functions, their original purpose obscured by centuries of adaptive reuse. We walk through them daily without asking why. We accept the official explanations without examining whether they actually explain anything, because examining them requires accepting that history isn't a straight line of progress, that we might be living in the remnants of something more sophisticated, something we didn't build, something we don't fully understand, that the giants in the photographs weren't aberrations, but evidence of a different arrangement, a different society, a different world. But the physical evidence doesn't stop with photographs and buildings. I found something else that no one wants to talk about. I stumbled across enormously sized chairs in estate auctions and forgotten museum storage rooms. Chairs that make no anatomical sense. Not thrones, not ceremonial pieces meant to intimidate or impress. Ordinary chairs. Dining chairs, desk chairs. Sitting chairs designed for daily use. Except they're scaled wrong. The seat height measures 30 to 36 inches from the floor, nearly double the standard 18-inch height that accommodates normal human leg length. The backrests tower 7, sometimes 8 feet high. The armrests sit at a height that would leave an average person's arms dangling uselessly. Auction catalogs list them as decorative furniture or display pieces, as if people in the 1800s routinely commissioned chairs they couldn't physically use just for aesthetic purposes. Museum curators label them oversized Victorian design without explaining why such designs appear in government buildings, administrative offices, and courthouse waiting rooms. Functional spaces where comfort and usability would presumably matter. And then there are the tools themselves. The artifacts no one wants to classify. I'm talking about the massive wrenches found in demolition sites across Europe and North America. Tools measuring 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet in length. Not decorative, not ceremonial. Functional tools with wear patterns, with the kind of grip erosion that comes from actual use. Tools designed for hands much larger than ours. Museums categorize them as industrial equipment without explaining what industrial process would require a wrench weighing 200 pounds that needs to be operated by someone with the grip strength of 3 normal men. And suddenly the oversized tools and furniture aren't anomalies anymore. They're confirmation of something we've been refusing to see. So who were these giant people? Were they the guardians of Tartaria? The administrative class of a civilization we've been taught never existed? The overseers of construction projects whose scale and precision we still can't replicate with modern technology? I don't have definitive answers, only questions that accumulate, that build upon each other, that create a weight the official narrative can't support. Why does the photographic evidence cluster in the exact decades when Tartaria disappears from maps? Why do architectural proportions match the scale of individuals in those photographs? Why do newspaper reports of giant skeleton discoveries stop precisely when references to advanced pre-industrial technology begin to be omitted from historical records? Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies that happen to align, pattern. And when you see the pattern, when you trace it across continents and centuries, when you watch it appear and disappear with suspicious precision, you have to ask, what aren't we being told? What did we inherit that we've chosen to forget? What knowledge was lost or hidden when the maps were redrawn and the giants disappeared from history? The buildings remember, even if we don't. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. The evidence persists, waiting for someone willing to ask the questions everyone else has agreed not to ask. Who were the giants? Why did they disappear? And what else vanished with them that we're still pretending was never here at all?